Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we are looking at the issue of in vitro fertilization, or commonly known as IVF. It has recently come up in the news, in the headlines, and the presidential elections of 2024. And we need to deal with it as Christians because we want to think through everything from a biblical perspective. So, a little backstory. In the 2024 election, it looks like the Democratic Party, the liberals, the leftists, are going to try to push abortion to the forefront of the election. They think that people in the modern world, in the 21st century, American citizens, they think that most American citizens are in favor of abortion. They are betting the house that most people in the United States don't care about the moral issue, don't care about the fact that it's killing babies, don't care about the fact that it is extinguishing, snuffing out the image bearer of God in the womb. They're counting on people just simply thinking of it in terms of freedom of choice, freedom over any restrictions for their body. So they're counting on women, mostly women, but also men. They're counting mostly women who will say, I don't want anyone telling me what to do with my body, no matter even if there's a living baby inside of my womb. I'm going to kill it if I want to. I'm going to destroy it if it gets in my way of whatever I want to do. They're counting, the Democrats are counting on people thinking that way. So they're pushing abortion heavy. And so now the Republican Party, looking at that, is saying, well, maybe the Democrats are right and abortion is something that a majority of people want. And so we need to begin to soften our views on abortion. That's what Donald Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, have been doing. They've been moderating or softening their views on abortion. Now, that's bad news from a Christian perspective because we are the guardians, so to speak, of the moral code. We have been entrusted by Jesus Christ with the good news. And part of the good news, not only is it salvation from sin and forgiveness of sin and eternal life, and that's the greatest news, but we also bring good news about how to live and the moral code and what is right and what is wrong. And so we bring good news, good tidings. And it is good news for a society to prohibit murder. It's good news for a society to prohibit the killing of babies in the wombs. It's good news for mothers to not kill their baby. And so it's good news for nations to try to stop all forms of violence and murder, especially whether it's in the womb or outside the womb. So that's good news. But people today in our twisted, sinful society see that as bad news because it won't let them do what they want to do. And the idol of our time seems to be personal freedom. I want to be able to do anything I want to do, whether it's moral or immoral, and I don't want to have any laws above me or beside me. I don't want God's laws. I don't want man's laws. I don't want anyone interfering with me and my autonomous decisions. That's the modern philosophical thinking, the secular humanistic thinking. And it's growing, unfortunately, and it's getting bigger in our country. So we live in a nation of people who are either approaching 50% or even more than 50% who have no problem with abortion. And so the Republicans and Trump specifically are trying to figure out a way to win those votes of these people that don't have a problem with abortion. And so they've concluded that they've got to moderate their view on abortion. And they also are appealing to women. And so the latest thing that Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, have come up with is that they're going to, Trump said it, that they're going to try to provide taxpayer-funded IVF treatment for couples that cannot have children. And if you don't know your Bible and if you don't do Christian theology, theology is basically thinking things through from a biblical perspective. So if you don't think things through from a biblical perspective, you might say, well, that's a great idea. Taxpayer-funded IVF, there are couples that want to have children and they can't have children. And so this would be Trump funding with government funds a program whereby couples that need to have scientific assistance in having children can do so, and the government will pay for it. And these are usually between $10,000 and $30,000 procedures, $10,000 to $30,000 each. And that's quite a chunk of change. And so anything that would help couples have children, that seems like a good thing, right? And a lot of Christians are joining in. Yeah, that's a good thing. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, well, yeah, I'm in favor of life. I'm against the culture of death. IVF is a promotion of life. It creates life. And so as Christians, we should be for life. And abortion is wrong because it creates death, and Christians should be against death. Well, that is too simplistic of an answer, because if you don't know what IVF is, you might think that it only has upside benefits. But if you look at IVF and actually examine what is taking place in an IVF clinic, in an IVF procedure, you will realize that this is not compatible the way it is currently undertaken. This is not compatible with Christian morality. And the reason it's not, the major reason, the big reason, and there are other ethical reasons, but this is the major reason. In an IVF clinic, a woman's eggs are taken from her body. They are then held in a laboratory, and then they are impregnated or fertilized with the male sperm. So if you have a couple come into the IVF clinic, they want to have a child, they've tried for years and they can't have one. Finally, they decide, let's go with IVF, in vitro fertilization. And so in vitro simply means in glass or on a petri dish. And so what they do is go into the clinic, and the doctor explains that the doctor will simply take out some of the eggs that occur in the woman every month, and they will then fertilize them with the sperm of the husband, and then they will typically fertilize between 5 and 10 eggs, and then they will look at those eggs and screen out the best ones, and take the best ones, and they will take the best one of the batch and put it in the woman. And the hope is that it will implant, and then it will grow into a healthy baby boy or girl. And so the couple, it's a great thing for the couple because they say, hey, we get to have a child. The problem is, and here is the ethical problem, this is the moral problem that a lot of people, including Christians, don't even think about, and they don't even acknowledge. So you have to understand what the process is before you can say it's either good or bad. And only after you understand what takes place in an IVF clinic, then you can make a decision, a moral and ethical decision. Because if you try to make one without the information about what actually takes place, then you're acting on ignorance. And so a lot of Christians need to get educated on what actually takes place. So I've just explained that between 5 and 10, sometimes more, eggs are fertilized. So you have a human embryo. These are called embryos in the scientific terms. It has the male sperm and the female egg, and it's a fertilized egg. It becomes, it's conceived. That's conception. That's conception. So you have 5 to 10 conceptions, human little embryo persons who have been brought into existence, their own unique DNA. And from a Christian perspective, we believe that they have the image of God and the likeness and image of God within them at the moment of conception. Because if you try to figure out some other stage in the life development cycle, you can't come up with anything other than an arbitrary point. Some people will say, well, they're only human until the point where they are born. Well, what about the baby that is 5 minutes from birth? That baby is not a human being? And then it's born and it's magically created a human being? No, that makes no sense philosophically, theologically, logically, rationally. It doesn't make any sense. We also know that babies can live outside the womb as early as, say, like 6 months. So you're simply coming up with an arbitrary point when you say, well, it's a human being at birth, and before that it's not. It's in the womb. That's nonsense. We all know that. Well, what about some people say, well, it's only a baby unless you can see the form. You can see the form of the baby in the womb, and when you recognize it as appearance in the womb, then that's the point when it's actually a human. Well, again, that's totally arbitrary. How do we know that a human being has to have the appearance of a human being? Somebody said, well, this human embryo that's created in the IVF, that can't be a human person because it doesn't even look like any human person. It doesn't even closely resemble anything living. And the answer to that is exactly at that stage of development what a human being should look like. And that is exactly how you look like when you were 1 day old after conception, or 2 days after conception, or a week after conception. That is exactly what you looked like, that you were that small, because that's the stage that human embryo is supposed to be at that time. So it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. At the moment of conception, that human embryo has the image of God in it, and the only thing it needs is time and nutrition for it to develop into a human adult. So you cannot use the argument, well, it doesn't look like a human, because that's exactly what humans do look like at that stage in the growth development cycle. And so there is no non-arbitrary point of view other than conception, and that's not arbitrary. That is a scientific fact, that is when a human life begins. That is when the person's DNA begins. That is when it all begins. And so to create 5 to 10 of these human embryos in a laboratory, and then to pick through them, select through them, and choose the best one, the one the scientists think are the healthiest, or the ones that meet certain standards that either the scientists have put forth or the parents. Sometimes this is the area where you can have sex selection. You can have all kinds of testing to see if they have any kinds of diseases or defects. And you're selecting out of those 10 human embryos, you're selecting one to implant in the mother's womb. And they select the healthiest one. Well, of course, obviously. But the problem is, what do you do with the 8 to 10 or the 9 that are left after the one that has been selected has been placed in the mother's womb? What do you do with the excess human embryos? Well, the IVF clinic usually offers a choice. They can be frozen for storage. So you're freezing these human being embryos for future use, or you can destroy them immediately after the IVF procedure. Now, usually they do freeze them because they want to make sure that the one implanted in the mother's womb actually produces a child. And so they want to save those embryos in case they may need to be rethawed out, and one of them, the best of the bunch, placed in the mother's womb for another chance at this. And so there's nothing wrong with a couple seeking to have a child and turning to science and saying, is it possible to fertilize my egg, if you're the woman, with my husband's sperm, and then have that fertilized egg human embryo placed in my womb and then bear a child? And the clinic will say, yes, it's possible. And so they say, well, let's do that. Now, the problem is, like I said before, the excess human embryos. It's you're using human embryos. You're using image bearers of God. You're using small human beings, and you're using them, and you're selecting the ones you want, and you're discarding the ones you don't want. That is not humane. That is unethical. Now you say, well, what if they just fertilize one egg and place that one egg in the mother's womb, and the egg was fertilized by the husband, and it's the mother's egg, and they fertilize one egg? Could that possibly be okay? Well, yeah, that could possibly be okay, because you're not doing anything that would violate the human rights of those fertilized human embryos. You're not discarding a image bearer of God, and that would be okay. But the IVF clinic would probably reject that and say, no, we don't want to do that, because we run the risk of then implanting a human embryo that might have defects, or it might not be a healthy human embryo. And see, in the natural process, the way God created this to take place, the way that it has been taking place from the beginning, is that not all of the woman's fertilized eggs do, in fact, go all the way through 9 months. So you'll have a miscarriage, or you will have an egg that's fertilized fail to implant in the mother's uterus, on the wall of the uterus, and you have all kinds of natural ways where the non-healthy fertilized eggs do not make it all the way through to birth. And that is nature's way of sort of screening out potential problems. Now, is miscarriage and problems in pregnancy, is that something that's good? No, it's not something that's good. It's a very sad and tragic thing. And the further along the pregnancy, the worse it becomes. I remember I've known a number of different couples that have had different miscarriages, and it's a very painful experience when there is a human being, there is a image bearer of God, who, for whatever reasons, is not able to go through the whole life cycle in the womb and be born. And sometimes they have to even bury the child if it's further enough along. But even if it's at the very beginning stage, it's something of a sadness and tragedy to realize that this human, this person, this image bearer of God didn't make it, even out of the gate. They didn't make it through the very first process. And so it's a sadness that happens because it's part of the fall. We live in a fallen world. In a non-fallen world, there would not be human being embryos that don't make it through the process. There would be no defects. There would be no problems in pregnancy. In a world without sin, all of these things would not take place. But we're living in a world of sin. We live in a fallen world. The Bible teaches us we live in a fallen world. It says nature itself groans to be freed from the state of fallenness. And so it's not surprising that the birth process does not take place 100% for every human embryo, every conception. It's not surprising at all because of the effects of sin on nature and so forth, not to mention the effects of chemicals and human-caused problems in our world. And so it's a tragedy when it happens, but we don't want to create that tragedy. It's, for example, it would be like children die every year. Thousands of children die every year. But that does not mean that people, adults, have the right to go around killing children because they die anyway. No, they die in a natural situation or in an accident or some tragic situation. That doesn't justify purposefully killing children. And the same way with the human embryos that are generated through IVS, that is not fair for those human embryos. It's not in accordance with the will of God. It's a disrespect of humanity. It's unethical. It's immoral. And while human embryos that are fertilized do perish in the womb, and there are miscarriages that occur all the time, and it's even more common that the women don't even know that an embryo that was fertilized perishes because they're not aware of what's taking place in their own womb. Okay, that occurs in nature, okay? But that doesn't give us as human beings the right and justification to purposely destroy human embryos. So we need to respect God's life process and not arbitrarily decide to kill life. And it is not justified in taking human life, even at the human embryo stage. It's not justified in taking human life just for the convenience of the parents or the adults. We have to have a greater justification than simply, we don't need those. We have a baby. The baby was born from the IVF process. We don't need those 9 other embryos that were in storage, so just go ahead and destroy them. No, we don't have that right to play God like that. If it occurs in nature and there was no human involved in making that decision, then that's one thing. But when humans decide they're going to kill image bearers of God, that's an ethical problem. So Christians need to think through this. And so when you hear someone like a Donald Trump, Republican candidate for president, saying, well, I want to fund an IVF program that will allow infertile couples to have children, and that shows that I really respect women's health issues. Okay, he's trying to appeal to that segment that is turned off by his stand on abortion. So he's going to say, well, I am for women's health. I want to fund a government program to help couples in the IVF process. Well, if you can do that without fertilizing 9 human embryos that will be discarded, fine. If you can fund a program that says only 1 egg from the woman can be fertilized at a time. So you fertilize that 1 egg, you implant it in the woman's uterus, and then you see if that child comes to birth. And if it does, praise the Lord. And hopefully it will. And you have no excess human embryos. You have no big problem there. And it's not a violation of thou shalt not murder. But if you're going to do what the typical IVF clinic does, and even if you say, well, we're not going to fertilize 10, we're going to only fertilize 5 and throw out 4. Well, you're still doing the same thing. You're still taking human life after conception. You're still aborting them. That's the same as abortion. It's not at the same degree of abortion. You're not like aborting a 9-month-old child, which is a tragedy, but you're taking the life of a newly fertilized human being. And that is still wrong. That is still ethically and morally wrong. So when you come at this whole IVF issue, you have to think it through. As pro-life Christians, do we really believe what we say? We say we believe a child is human from the moment of conception, right? Because every other indicator is arbitrary, as I've explained before. So if we really believe that human beings are human beings at conception, then we have to oppose for these excess human embryos being discarded or frozen. Now, some people say, well, you didn't kill them because they're still frozen. The problem is the vast majority of these frozen embryos that are in storage right now. It's probably the case that they are in storage mostly for just conscience purposes. If you, for example, this would be the case if you had a Christian couple who goes in and they have 9 that are frozen, and the one is implanted in the mother's womb for the child. These 9, they aren't destroyed. They're just kept frozen. Now, why are they kept frozen? Is it because they might want to implant one of them later in the mother's womb? Possibly, but there are risks with that because then you're having to thaw out a frozen embryo, and that can introduce all kinds of ways for defects and problems in the birth, in the pregnancy process. So it's mostly, I would imagine, the ability to say, well, no, those discarded embryos are still there. They're still alive. They're frozen. The problem is that most of these human embryos that are frozen, they will perish. That's the sad truth. You have thousands and thousands and thousands of these image bearers of God, human embryos. Get that? Human. They're human. And they are being frozen, and they're just sitting there in a state of limbo, and they'll stay there forever until the IVF clinic either contacts the parents and say, do you want us to continue freezing these, or do you want them discarded? And eventually, most of these, vast majority, 99%, 99.999% will perish. So whether you freeze them immediately or destroy them, it basically comes down to these frozen embryos that have been discarded from the initial phase of IVF, they will perish. And that's immoral. That's unethical. I'm sorry that a lot of Christians are confused on this. I'm sorry that they only look at the benefit of the couple getting a child. I'm sorry that they're not thinking more deeply. But as Christians, we have to think deeply. We cannot just simply react on an emotional level and go, oh, that's great. This procedure lets couples have children. Yes, but what's the cost? What's the price that you pay for that? Is it worth destroying human life to get one life? Is it worth destroying 9 human lives to get one life? I mean, it's a problem morally. It's got a moral problem. It's not an ethical procedure. And so as Christians, we need to discourage Donald Trump and the Republicans from going that direction, saying, look, understand you need to win elections. We appreciate all you've done in the pro-life movement, but you're not working from principles here. You're just trying to be politically expedient. And we discourage you from going in that direction because that is a dead-end street, literally. And we don't want to go down there. We don't want that kind of immoral thing taking place. Hope that's been helpful. We'll see you back next week.